Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Geisha Gonzalez, and I'm the Associate Director here at the Eurasia Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, where we're launching our report, Democratic Defense Against Disinformation. This report is really a culmination of our Stratcom conference last year, where we brought together the transatlantic community of experts, policymakers, tech experts to talk about the challenge of disinformation and how to build responses for it. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Jim Fry, who is the managing editor of Polygraph.info, and who will lead the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, hello, everybody. Here we are talking about an important report today, but I have to say in just the last week, we've seen stories like this emerge in the media. A former employee of a troll farm from Russia is living in Seattle. A global data firm concludes that Sputnik radicalized the debate around the Italian election and immigration. And the head of the NSA says Russia has yet to pay a price for its 2016 election meddling. The remarkable thing about these stories is that actually they're not very remarkable anymore. They're in fact a follow-up to a story that Americans learned about a little over a year ago, and that is the fact that the 2016 election was, that there was indeed Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And so that underscores the jumping off point of where we are here today in talking about this report. The report, The Democratic Defense Against Disinformation, recognizes that this is a story that we know already, and it follows up with a number of things, of steps that government and business can take. So we have here today the two authors of the report, Ambassador Daniel Fried, who is a distinguished fellow at the Eurasia Center here. His foreign service career reaches back all the way to the Cold War and a different kind of disinformation from the Soviet bloc. He is among those who recognized when the Soviet Union was falling apart and helped craft the US policy to deal with that afterwards. Dr. Alina Polyakova, who is the David Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings, formerly the Director of Research here at the Atlantic Council, an expert on Russian foreign policy and the far-right political parties in Europe, and she is a prolific voice in the transatlantic community on this issue. Also on the panel, Ms. Corina Rebegea, the director of the US-Romanian Initiative, the fellow and resident at the Center for European Analysis. Ambassador David O'Sullivan, who is on the front lines as the EU ambassador to the United States, and Jonathan Hennick, who is the deputy coordinator of the Global Engagement Center at the US State Department. So we have this report that goes through an enormous list of things that both the United States, Europe, and private industry can do. But I'd like to look, first of all, at the First Amendment, freedom of speech, the recognition that government in the United States really cannot and should not silence speech, no matter how outlandish. So therefore, we see Sputnik and RT here, whereas U.S. government broadcasting is not seen in Russia very much. So let me ask you, you are recommending a number of actions that U.S. government should take. Can you tell me how does that square with the requirements of the First Amendment?
We started, Alina Polyakova and I started our work based on an assumption that we had to fight disinformation within the norms of our democracy and democratic behavior. As we learned in the Cold War, we don't have to become them in order to fight them. So that was the first principle. A second principle is that human beings have First Amendment rights. And human beings in America are entitled to those rights. It's not as clear to me that bots enjoy First Amendment rights. Nor is it clear to me that First Amendment rights means that I have a right to access to the New York Times editorial page. Certainly a bot does not have a right of access. Therefore, it's within First Amendment norms and the norms of free expression to try to help and urge that social media companies organize themselves to limit bots and try to apply the principle, a human behind every keyboard. All right, so that's an answer to your question. What we did in the study is unpack the challenge of disinformation. There's over-propaganda, social media manipulation, and cyber hacking, right? 3 layers. And those layers work together. Our response needs to combine government action, civil society groups, bot hunters, tech-savvy people in their 20s, not old men like me, right, who can spot and expose disinformation campaigns, and social media companies, private firms, who really do have a responsibility to make sure that they are not a playground for malign actors, and they can do so with editorial judgment, design of better algorithms. There are a host of options. The final and the biggest, our final principle and the biggest single recommendation is that we recognize that this is not an American problem. Europeans have been dealing with this for a long time, and some of them have been ahead of us. But we got, when we went to Europe and we did the report with a lot of European input, we got from a lot of Europeans is, well, it's about time you showed up. You know, it's good you're here. Our biggest recommendation is that the US and Europe together organize a kind of informal coalition of the best of the stakeholders. Governments, private groups, civil society, social media companies, to deal with the problem, to develop common norms, common approaches, definitions operationally of what respect for free expression means. Europe doesn't have First Amendment, we do, we both have freedom of expression. So we need to come up with best practices to guide our response. That's not going to be easy, but we came up with a menu of doable options because we felt it was time to stop admiring the problem and wringing our hands about it and start coming out with a menu of options, and to do so with the Europeans. We are in this together.
And we do have the ambassador from the EU here today, and the First Amendment, as you point out, is not the exact, there's freedom of expression, but it's not a factor in terms of how government can respond in Europe. And in the report, you call for the EU and NATO to play a direct role in countering propaganda, debunking misinformation, and requiring impartiality. And you also mention Ofcom, and that is an effort that European nations can take to essentially watch the media and regulate when the media has gone way out of bounds. Ofcom has cited, for example, RT and also Fox News. So Ambassador O'Sullivan, let me ask you, is there some danger, however, in overreach if European governments go a little bit far in this? Because as we know, the Russian disinformation machine is very good at taking something that another government does and using that disinformation to say, look, they're doing the same thing that they accuse us of doing. Is there a danger of overreach in this?
I suppose there's always a danger of overreach, and we have to be careful. If I may just, I mean, firstly, I agree largely with everything Dan said. I mean, you know, I think we share the analysis. This report very well identifies the challenge, which is that what is being done is it's using the fault lines within our political system. It's using the freedoms granted by our political system for a political effect. And we have to push back on this. I think I would like to say we don't have the First Amendment, but we are just as passionately committed to free expression and free media. I mean, there should be no misunderstanding about that. We occasionally render something illegal, which perhaps would not happen here, hate speech, Holocaust denial, because we feel from a European perspective we need to do this, and our history shows us why. But we are passionately committed to the principle of freedom of expression, and we have to understand that our democracies thrive and exist on that. On the other hand, we have, I think, ways of revealing what is going on, the manipulation which is going on, which works with the platforms, with civil society, and with resilience more generally. I mean, I think the key here is, and it's mentioned in the report, it's a whole of society response. It's not, there is no silver bullet for governments to sort of pass a law which suddenly makes this problem go away. So I think there is perhaps a risk of overreach, but I think the main thing is a vibrant public debate, exposing what is happening, working with the platforms to address ways in which they can avoid being exploited, which is frankly what's happening. And most importantly, having this out in the open and discussed with the public and through all media sources to explain what is actually happening and the manipulation that is being used.
As Ambassador Fried mentioned, there are a number of other aspects to this, not just government, for example, private industry, and I want to get to that in a minute. But we do have Jonathan from the Global Engagement Center here. The Global Engagement Center at the State Department is definitely a part of this report, has been focused, and you can represent it better than me, but has been focused much for the past few years on the terrorism issue, and now is refocusing. But it has been in the news in the last couple of days. The New York Times article indicating that, as the New York Times put it, $120 million has been, so to speak, left on the table for this, on this issue. So, you know, what the media has been saying, the New York Times has been saying, is that it is either the administration, which has been passive to this, or your boss, the Secretary of State, who doesn't trust, according to the reports, the people within the State Department. I'm wondering if you can tell us what is it that's held up this $120 million, and define what it is too.
Sure. If I could just take a step back first, I couldn't agree with Ambassador Fried and Ambassador Sullivan more about the nature of the problem and that requiring a whole of society approach. And as Ambassador Fried knows better than perhaps any of us, this is not a new problem. We've been dealing with this problem for the better part of the last century. And as such, it's really important to note that, you know, although the Global Engagement Center has been given this mission really a little bit over a year ago, that the Global Engagement Center is really, in a sense, in the US government, just the tip of the iceberg. It's above the water in terms of our efforts to counter disinformation. We are countering, you know, disinformation from, you know, adversaries, from threats, whether it's non-state or state actors, every day, all around the world. Our ambassadors, our public affairs officers, our information officers, not to speak of our military colleagues, you know, here in the Pentagon or at the combatant commands. This is, you know, both a, you know, literally a whole of government in addition to a whole of society effort. That said, as you pointed out, the Global Engagement Center was given this counter-state mission a little bit over a year ago. And I think the intent of that is to redouble our efforts to make sure that we are investing in these new technologies, these new platforms, and to make sure that we are using the latest tools available to, you know, to be able to coordinate and focus our efforts. So to respond to the, you know, recent press, I think the New York Times article mischaracterizes a little bit, with all due respect, the nature of what's been going on. There was a congressional authorization that allowed the Global Engagement Center to ask the Department of Defense for up to $60 million for each of the last 2 fiscal years. There was never an appropriation. In other words, there's not money sitting around anywhere. You know, the Pentagon, once we made this request, has to go and find money from, you know, pre-funded, pre-existing programs to be able to, you know, transfer that money over to the State Department. So, and I do need to certainly take issue with any kind of characterization that our secretary is less than fully engaged on this issue. He's been engaged on it a number of times, has personally, you know, approved an approach that we've outlined. We've spent the last several months negotiating with the Department of Defense exactly how we would spend this money. We've made tremendous progress in the last couple weeks in terms of finalizing a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Defense. And so we do expect, the first tranche of about $40 million to be moved from Department of Defense over to the Department of State in the coming weeks. But really, really, again, important to note that it's not like we're sitting still waiting for this money to begin working on this problem. We've been working on this problem, including the Global Engagement Center, for over the last year, actively monitoring, analyzing, developing new tools, coordinating, working with other parts of the State Department, with other parts of the US government to address this issue. This money will give us, I think, additional resources to be able to, maybe fill in certain gaps or procure some of these new technologies we're talking about, and hopefully even to empower some of the civil society and other actors out there to be partners in this effort.
Let me just follow up very briefly, if you can just very briefly talk about this. Is the Global Engagement Center going to set up a troll farm on L Street somewhere?
Is the Global Engagement Center going to what?
Are they going to set up a troll farm on L Street somewhere?
Absolutely not. I think, as Ambassador Fried noted, the solution to this problem is going to look nothing like the problem itself. We're going to need to work with, to strengthen independent media, to build up resistance, to increase digital literacy. Yes, there will be elements of it that involve, debunking false narratives out there, but social science research has shown that that approach has only, a limited effect. And so we're going to need to be much more creative in how we address this particular problem. And it's not going to involve, troll farms, I promise you that.
We've been talking a lot about what government can do both here and in Europe, but there are major things that can happen when it comes to civil society and also the private sector, and that's where I want to turn right now, Dr. Polyakova. The report anticipates a joint effort between U.S. intelligence agencies and the private sector companies. Given that the tech firms have often resisted what looks like any kind of close relationship with United States intelligence and the government, is this something that's possible?
Well, just to follow up on the earlier comments, one, we haven't mentioned the R word, which is Russia, of course, in this conversation. And there's a reason for that, though. It's not that we're trying to avoid the elephant in the room, but for us, in writing this report, it was also very clear that while the focus is on Russia right now, these are the kinds of tools that are easily diffused and are already being used by various other state and non-state actors to try to influence or undermine countries, Western democratic countries, as they see as adversarial to them. And so Russia is a starting point, but this is really about much more than just one state actor. It's really about the resilience and resistance that we can build in our democracies to future interference in these ways. And we used to have that kind of resilience back in the Cold War days, frankly, in the United States. So we had much more resources and agencies at the governmental level, and also much more awareness at the societal level as to what communist propaganda was. And we worked to expose that, and our leaders talked about it very openly. And I think these are the kinds of things we need to look back to again. And I also think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from the counterterrorism, countering violent extremism space. So for example, in our conversations with our European friends, one thing that we learned about very quickly was a voluntary code of conduct that social media companies signed on to in Europe when it came to monitoring or taking down extremist content. That is a model that could be replicated when it comes to disinformation campaigns as well. It's a little trickier, but there's precedent for this, is the point. So when we're talking about what is the role of the private sector in all of this, to go directly to your question, we are not advocating for a heavy regulatory hand. I don't think that there will be a lot of political support for that in the United States. I think in Europe, there are other regulatory tools that have been used and that are being used. Here in the United States, most of these companies, if not all of them, are US companies, right? So they have a responsibility, and they say they want to change their ways. And what we're advocating for, and what we suggest, is not heavy regulation on the one hand, and we're also not suggesting them just deleting content, censorship, or any of that. But what they do need to do is very clearly label what is identified as propaganda. Like RT, for example, has had to register as a foreign agent in the United States. That label could easily appear on all their content online. That's just one example. I think another example is muting and deranking content that is not credible, meaning these fly-by-night news sites nobody's ever heard of, and suddenly they amplify some piece of information or misinformation, and it goes viral. But then nobody even knows where it came from eventually, right? These kinds of disinformation campaigns can be identified today, and they can't stop them at the beginning. And I think this will go a long way. And so far, frankly, neither Facebook or Twitter has done enough, I think, in my view, in our view, to really combat this situation. And just very lastly, is to this discussion on the Global Engagement Center, I think is really relevant. But one thing that we also realize, and this is also what we learned from our friends in Sweden, who also helped us understand what they're doing to try to combat interference in their elections, is that there has to be a domestic mandate. And the State Department doesn't have a domestic mandate, meaning they don't operate in the United States, they operate externally. So it's very clear to us that it has to be the Department of Homeland Security in coordination with other agencies that tries to take the lead on these issues.
Does it require, if I can go back to the question of with these tech firms and with the social media firms, does it require voluntary compliance, or are you proposing laws that
I think ideally that is our recommendation. And just as a side note, we also passed this earlier drafts of this report around to the social media firms, and they read them and they gave us comments. So that was very useful. Their concern, from what we heard anyways, is that they don't actually know who to talk to on these issues in the US government. You could say that's an excuse, but I think that's also a reality. So they don't have a clear point of contact. They're concerned about data protection issues and privacy issues of their users. But these are all things that have been figured out in the CT, counterterrorism, CVE space, and I think those kinds of processes can be implemented here. But we clearly need some leadership point of contact position within governments to be able to liaise with the private sector on this.
Are these firms ready to do this, or will they resist still?
I mean, I have a personal view, and then I have what their comments have been. I mean, they say they're ready, and that they're keen to have a closer dialogue and communication with USG and other government agencies. I think at the end of the day, there's going to take some regulatory pressure, and we've seen a lot more regulatory pressure in Europe than we have in the United States. So I think there's a lot more that we can do without going into infringement upon First Amendment rights or anything like that.
I want to ask about that regulatory pressure in Europe from Corina, but let me follow up one more time on this. What Russia has done, my understanding is, has developed a number of software solutions where the government itself gets involved in regulating and controlling the information that gets out on social media and on the internet. If we're tasking our private sector to do this, is there a danger that that sort of thing is going to be developed and becomes a problem here? Meaning software solutions that somehow become, who, for example, at these companies is going to control this? Who's going to make these decisions? And then in liaison with the US government, how would the US government be involved? I mean, I think there'd be some suspicion in society over that.
Well, look, right now we have zero transparency as to how Facebook, Twitter, Google algorithms work. I mean, there is obviously intellectual property component here where they don't want to share these trade secrets. These algorithms are highly, highly protected. But I think the realization that they're, coming to is that these algorithms are not morally and ethically neutral. Right? That they primitize, emphasize certain content over others. And it's not just about the social media firms. There's an entire industry behind all of this, right? When it comes to big data and micro-targeting, if we think about how the disinformation campaigns happen in the United States and also in other European countries, this has a lot to do with identifying specific populations and targeting these divisive messages to those very specific populations. Those kinds of tools were readily available by these social media firms, by the ISP providers. There's a lot more that can be done to look at the industry as a whole. I think it starts with the social media companies, but that's certainly not the full environment. And I think at the end of the day, yes, they have to protect their proprietary intellectual property rights and privacy rights of their users and account holders, But right now, there's zero transparency on how they do this kind of business, and they profit from it significantly.
Corina, is there any more transparency in Europe with some of these social media companies and tech companies? Is the regulatory, as Alina suggests, is the regulatory environment a little more strict for them there?
There's at least a promise of more transparency. And I think this is where we can notice a huge difference between the US and the EU. So you're alluding to the data protection regulation that the EU has just amended, and that will force social media companies to be more transparent about what they do with the data they collect about the users. So every time my personal data is being collected by Facebook on behalf of a third company, I will have to sign off on that. So that's already eliminating an intermediary, and then social media companies will have to appoint, to your question earlier, will have to appoint a person of contact that will deal with these issues in relation to the users, but also to the authorities. So I think that is a promise of transparency and of more data protection to defend users from micro-targeting, from their data being used by maybe illicit, illegal, obscure actors on the market, something that maybe the US should consider. I mean, if you look at the way marketing companies here and polling firms here use all sorts of data that is collected on a variety of platforms, if you go into the details of that, it's going to show a very scary picture about how much information is being collected and how vulnerable it is to all sorts of hostile actors. But going back to the issue of First Amendment, which, just to reinforce what Ambassador O'Sullivan has said, freedom of speech is an important, core right in Europe. You have the convention, the European Convention for Human Rights, and you have the EU Charter for Human Rights. They're both upheld by supranational courts, so for anyone who feels that their right has been infringed, there's not only a national jurisdiction, but also a supranational jurisdiction. And there are ways to go about it. For instance, a couple of years ago, Lithuania has suspended for 3 months a Russian TV station based on Article 6 of the European Charter for the EU Charter for Human Rights, based on spreading hate speech and incitement to hatred and conflict in their reporting about the war in eastern Ukraine. So I think there are ways in which we can preserve the democratic values and safeguards that we care so much about and are fundamental for our societies, but at the same time go against these bad actors.
If I can
Sure.
go back a minute ago, I think what you were referring to, if I'm not mistaken, for those who are involved in this or are not quite sure of it, the EU has just passed something called the General Data Protection Regulation. And what I'm wondering about in terms of micro-targeting is, will this give the EU the ability to stop micro-targeting by so-called bad actors, such as the troll farms and any of that sort of thing that's coming out of Russia? And then then where do you stop that, for example, in regular political advertising, or at least here in the United States? This micro-targeting can and I suppose should be used by the Democratic and Republican parties, but then if we think it's being used to spread disinformation, you'd want to stop that, right?
Invoking First Amendment or free expression cannot be a conversation stopper. We have, in the United States, has banned certain kind of advertisements for a long time. Cigarettes, can't advertise them. We ban foreign ads and foreign campaign contributions, foreign political ads in a campaign context. There are bills pending in Congress to introduce greater transparency, make these rules more effective. There is nothing wrong with actually enforcing transparency with respect to political ads. The Honest Ads Act that's in Congress, or forcing placers of political ads to reveal the actual funders of the ads. an ad sponsored by Americans for Puppies is going to look different if you find it's sponsored by the St. Petersburg Troll Farm. There are all kinds of options available to us. And the Americans and the Europeans need to come together using this the platform maybe of the Counter Disinformation Coalition we suggest, to come up with the best practices and then test these ideas. See what works. Now, we are under no illusion. It's a moving target. Russian disinformation is evolving. We do not believe that these specific suggestions in our paper are the end. They're a beginning. And we need, the threat will evolve, so must our countermeasures. But let's start with that. And start with an understanding that there's plenty we can do. We need to start doing it. And work with US government, tech firms, social media companies, and private entrepreneurs that are working in this space. An example of how Russian disinformation and hacking can be exposed and combated effectively was the last days of the French presidential election. The Russians hacked into the Macron campaign and were going to release some emails. They were spotted. This campaign was exposed by French, basically bot hunters and cyber sleuths who went in and exposed it. And there was an immediate reaction in France that they would shut down any discussion of emails obtained in an illegal manner. It was like a social reaction against this interference.
Can I interject here? So the cover of this report is actually the analysis that the group is credited for doing on the Macron Leaks campaign. It's by EU Disinfo Labs. This is not just a fancy picture. It's actually the real network mapping of how disinformation spread through these specific accounts into the French media space. So that was just a side note.
Right. So the point, and the French, when they were explaining what they did, said, we learned from your mistakes. We weren't going to go that way. And we need to learn from each other. This was a successful example of countering disinformation, working within the democratic norms. So you don't have to have an abstract discussion of whether it's possible. We know that it is possible, and it's been done in Europe.
Ambassador O'Sullivan.
No, just, I think it would be a mistake to get the impression that somehow in Europe we think there's a way to regulate this. And the reference to the General Data Protection Regulation, which I frequently discuss in other contexts here in Washington, it was not conceived in this context at all. It is a consolidation of our data privacy laws. It's about the protection of individuals' data privacy. It consolidates and slightly builds on that. It was not designed to be used in this context, and frankly, I think it is of limited use in this context. It poses other issues with the US perhaps, or US firms are worried about complying with it, but it is not the most relevant, in my view, point of reference. The most relevant point of reference is the code of conduct we agreed with the platforms on the taking down of illegal content. To Dan's point, I think getting caught up in the abstract discussion of the First Amendment, freedom of expression, we know what we're dealing with. For example, child pornography, we've all agreed that this should be taken down, that the platforms have accepted a responsibility in that regard. We believe we need to go a step further, particularly as regards illegal content on hate speech or radicalization. Something which is illegal if you photocopied it in your garage should be illegal if it's on the web. But the problem here is that the issue we're dealing with is not so much stuff which is illegal. It's more insidious than that, and more invidious than that. And there I agree entirely with Dan. It is about, and Alina, it's about the transparency. If social media is being manipulated consciously to produce certain outcomes, this should come out, and the platforms do have the ability, as we've seen, to identify this and to even identify where it may be coming from. And it is, to go back to that word, but to me it's the most important word, it is about the transparency. It's not about government controlling the information. It's about the public understanding where the information is coming from and what is the motivation. It's not about muzzling it and making it impossible for people to have the information. It's just about explaining this is manipulation, this is in many cases false or misleading information, And it is not coming from people who are seeking to inform, it is coming from people who have a political objective of actually fomenting discontent or social divisions which may have political consequences. So I think it's important, and I agree entirely that we need to work together on this. We have the same objectives, but I would not wish to give the impression that we in Europe somehow believe that there's a super regulatory solution to this. Some regulation may be part of the toolbox, but it's certainly not going to solve the problem in its entirety.
I think you just, well, go ahead. You just made a key point, and that is that the tech firms, the social media firms, can identify this material. Only yesterday, Reddit kicked off a bunch of Russian trolls and bad actors, but that was months and months and months after the fact. I mean, I think we're talking about, can this happen in real time, and who does it? And is there, because some of this involves political arguments that some people would tend to agree with. In Italy, you had a large part of the population that obviously agreed with some of the messages that were being spread. Here in the United States, you can see that happens. So then, who makes these decisions, and how does it get done, so that that doesn't happen again in 2018 or 2020 or in the next European election?
Just to chime in on that, Ambassador, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as well. I think we should be clear that we and no one is asking the social media companies to be the arbiters of truth.
Right.
Right? No one is suggesting that. That burden should not be on them. Frankly, it should not be in any single actor or individual organization. But go back to this transparency point, you can't also put all the burden on the individual user to do the research when they're looking at their Facebook feed and they see, some piece of news, or they think it's news that somebody else posted. And Facebook's click-through rate is like incredibly low for ads. Nobody clicks on anything, but often people share stuff without even reading it. So asking a person to click on something, then look at the web page and see, oh, who is this funded by someone? Do I know these funders? Are they funding something else? To do this kind of research is actually, unfortunately, unrealistic in our societies today, where people want to consume information quickly, right? But there are really small technical fixes that could work. So one is, look at your newsfeed, instead of you having to click through an ad, which then of course drives the ad forward, there's another story, they can put the funder and the sponsor directly in your newsfeed, right? And it may be something strange, like Americans for Puppies, right? But at least they'll give you some, like this is not neutral content, it is being put up here for a reason, and here's who's funding it, right? Just take a little bit of the effort away from the individuals, because frankly, individuals enjoy to some extent, like Facebook experimented with labeling something as disputed content, and they had to stop the experiment because actually made people click on it more in some cases, right? So what does that tell us about human psychology? I think it tells us that people crave information that is kind of explosive, that is controversial, that conforms to their point of view, right? As our colleague Geisha Gonzalez often says, it's like junk food, right? You're not going to be able to get people off junk food and burgers just by telling them that, this is really bad for you, you should probably eat broccoli, right? So the question is, the culmination of all these little fixes, EU, NATO, government level policies, working together in a relatively uncoordinated way. We're not suggesting some sort of top-down, Ministry of Information or something like this, can have over time an effect.
I guess when we leave, we'll be eating broccoli and not burgers today. You'll have to remind me of that.
I eat broccoli anyway.
So let me ask you about civil society, because we've talked about both government and the private industry. Where else can these efforts be enhanced, both here and in Europe?
Well, we're counting a lot on civil society groups, which already exist in Europe and the United States. In Washington, German Marshall Fund and Atlanta Council have sponsored their own tech-savvy bot hunters and cyber sleuths that are busy right now pointing out Russian disinformation campaigns and exposing them and doing the forensic analysis That's the Baltic, in Europe, Baltic Elves, Czech, Slovak groups, the French who uncovered the Macron hacking, they're all out there. They need to be listened to, they need some support, they need to be part of the conversation. And social media companies could benefit us all by working with these groups so that they know about Russian campaigns and others' campaigns. This is actually doable. And in addition to the social media companies, tech firms, ISPs, may have a role to play. Look, I'm not a tech-savvy person, but I suspect that there are ways to uncover bots and outside machine-driven content. They don't have First Amendment rights. And it's not a heavy regulatory lift or creating ministries of truth to treat bots as they should be treated. They don't have First Amendment rights. The slogan should be, a human being behind every keyboard. Now, one person's troll is another person's activist. But it is certainly possible to go after the St. Petersburg troll farm, and as the old sanctions person at the State Department, I think we ought to be sanctioning the troll farm and all of its funders. And that means all of its downstream commercial activity is redlined and made radioactive. If you add up all of these individual steps, you have an imperfect set of tools of resistance. Now, in the long run, an informed society is going to be more resilient and more able to understand, to discriminate in its information. The way new media revolutions throughout history result in a certain period of anarchy and ugliness. The printing press doesn't just produce Gutenberg's Bible, it produces all sorts of tracts and inflammatory pamphlets, and it takes society a while to sort out the good from the bad facing a new technology. Our job is to help shorten the time, the lead time for societies to adjust to the reality of new information and to limit the damage. So keep your expectations under control, use all the tools available, stay true to your values, and incrementalism works if you add it up.
Can I just add a little something
Go
here?
ahead.
I think we're still behind in our learning from these bottom-up initiatives, and think tanks or government agencies. And because you referenced the French election, something else that was remarkable happened during the electoral campaign, when big or small media organizations formed the coalition to debunk fake news and to keep out obscure websites or pretend media that was spreading disinformation. So whoever was outside this coalition was immediately flagged as being suspicious of acting on behalf of a foreign actor or spreading fake news. And during the German elections, a comedian was able to take down 30 Facebook pages affiliated with the Alternative für Deutschland, just by infiltrating and in the end making fun of the users. And there are a lot of initiatives like that we haven't yet been able to explore and understand how we can turn this, or at least make people to learn from each other. Because the benefit is that they're closer to an audience we would like to reach in terms of educating the public about disinformation and the risks of fake news and so on. And they have the credibility. It's not top down. It's not coming from the government. It's coming from someone you can identify with as part of your constituency and so on. And so at CIPA, we actually spend a lot of time looking at narratives, but also we're looking at methods and how we might use this wealth of information we've accumulated from the region to turn them into concrete actions. And we had a seminar in Poland in December, and two things came up. One was strategic narratives, and this doesn't have to be the government. It could be individual government agencies when they're doing their strategic communications, but it can also be NGOs. And I think here, and this is something we've been working on, working with smaller civic groups, not necessarily in this area of expertise, to help them with their storytelling, with reconnecting to their constituency. They may turn out to be a better vehicle for education and for insulating, for vaccinating the public against disinformation.
Can I just add one more thing? I mean, I agree with all the other panelists in terms of points, but I'd like to add another layer of complexity to this whole problem, which is that these malign actors are not pursuing centralized strategies. They're pursuing very, very localized strategies that are designed to exploit and drive a wedge, between local populations. In addition, the environments that they're working in are very, very different, from country to country and even within countries. The media environment's different, the regulatory environment's different, the media ownership environment's different, the popularity of social media platforms varies from country to country. As a result, the approach, the solutions, the tools that we use to address this problem are of necessity going to be incredibly complex, incredibly varied, and I think effective only if they're incredibly localized to address the problems in those specific locations.
I have a question that goes to that. I just wanted to mention to everybody that in about 10 minutes or so, we'll go to questions from the audience. I want to get to two more issues. And the first one is you propose something that you call a fire hose of truth in the report, that there be information going out to audiences that basically, as you put it, inoculate these audiences from the disinformation and from the propaganda. I have to tell you, in my job at Polygraph, I'm watching Sputnik and RT every day, and I counted a couple of hours during the day yesterday where Sputnik, on only one of its Twitter feeds, tweeted 18 times on an average per hour. That didn't count, RT didn't count about 3 or 4 other Twitter feeds that they do. If you're going to do this fire hose of truth, I presume some of that would be Global Engagement Center, some of it would be civil society. It sounds like an enormous amount of, it sounds like more than $40 million to do that. What are you proposing? I mean, how can that be taken on?
I mean, without getting into these metaphors too much, but we do need to remember that the tools and the solutions are not all going to be new and exciting and high tech and social media. The Broadcasting Board of Governors and Voice of America and BBC and other and just frankly just private sector media is going to be probably the biggest part of this solution, which is in the end there does need to be accurate, objective, independent information out there. Absent that, it's very easy for malign actors to peddle disinformation and exploit these types of divisions. And so we're going to need to continue to invest in these tools as well to make sure that there is accurate information out there. In addition to telling our story, putting out accurate information about what our policies are, exposing patterns of disinformation if and when we see them. There again, it just back to, I forget which of the panels mentioned, but there is going to be no one silver bullet to this particular problem. And getting out, another problem is that we talk about this as countering disinformation, and I have a problem with that characterization because it inherently sounds reactive. Mm-hmm. And I think in order to address this problem, we're going to need to not just be reacting, but we're going to need to proactively, to your point, inoculate, if that's the right analogy, make sure that people have accurate information so that when faced with disinformation, they're less likely to buy into it.
And I'll take that word one further. At Polygraph, we call it covering disinformation because we do a fact check of disinformation, but we do it as journalists, and so we cover it rather than counter it as well. But Dr. Polyakova.
I was going to follow up on that. I think the providing fact-based, good, independent journalism is one part of this longer-term resilience picture, right, that we talk about. I think right now, I agree with my colleagues that we are just behind. We're really behind. I mean, it's 2018. The initial disinformation campaigns here in the United States that we've identified, and they've been ongoing for a long time, happened in 2016. And where are we? We're still having this conversation about options and what should we do and where should we start. So I think we need immediate steps to be taken now, but of course in the longer term there is a whole other set of issues that we need to be concerned. One of them is of course providing accurate information, making people try to understand and try to take some initiative for their own information consumption practices. But I think, you mentioned, I think, social studies that show that how individuals respond to certain information, right? What we know, again, about human psychology is that when you're given information that doesn't conform to your point of view, you reject it right away. So the question is, how do we frame factual information in a way that is appealing emotionally to individuals and makes them want to consume it more so than other forms of misinformation? And I think kind of working at the edge, right? So how do you give somebody something that, still tastes good and is good, a little better for them than cheeseburger, but not really broccoli, right? To get them maybe on the path towards broccoli, just to take this, metaphor.
Maybe that's what I'll have for lunch.
Right? But I think this is the big question, is that it's going to take a lot of effort, and we are at risk of falling far, far behind the state and non-state actors, the malicious actors who are trying to undermine our democratic process.
Can I take just one issue with something Alina said? I don't think it's fair to say that we haven't started to address this problem. This is a problem. I spent most of my career as a foreign service officer overseas, working on public affairs and public diplomacy, and this is a problem I've been dealing with throughout my quarter century of career overseas. We do have lots and lots, thousands of people who are dedicated to working on this. Of course, maybe it's not a full-time job for everybody, but making sure that there's accurate information out there, making sure that we're combating these types of false narratives. That said, I do agree that the problem has reached new levels, and it's clear that there's a lot more we can do. And I think that the Atlantic Council's report has really some terrific suggestions in there that we should be taking into account.
Whether or not there's a recognition that there's more we can do or we're behind, it's an interesting point, because there's another problem emerging that we don't get to so much in this report, but you have, Alina, and that is artificial intelligence and cheap data, the continuing emergence of that. And the fact that under artificial intelligence, we're going to folks will be able to create, and already are creating, video and audio that's almost impossible to deconstruct. Is it possible that, much like the generals who are preparing to fight the last war, maybe we're doing that now?
Well, if you put the question that way, the only answer is sure, there's a danger. And at such points in the U.S. government, things would be remanded back for further work. Fast forward 3 years, nothing happens. We don't pretend that our particular set of solutions is going to be, it's certainly not going to be complete. The threat is evolving. We need to be on our toes and ready to respond accordingly. The strategic point of our report is that we have options consistent with our values, and we have potential allies. Speaking as an American, we have potential allies in Europe. We have an array of actors that are waiting to work with us, and there are parts of the U.S. government already structured, in existence, trying to grapple with the problem. So the question is one of leadership to bring it together. When there is a problem and a political imperative, I'm just speaking in a Washington perspective, when there's a problem and a political imperative to do something and to be seen as doing something about it, I see opportunity for someone in the government to come in and take ownership of the issue. All right? There are several ways it could be parked. And the bureaucratics of where you place the initiative in the U.S. government is less important than someone taking strategic leadership and putting things together and working with the Europeans, because we can't do this alone. And it is possible. It's a matter of recognizing it, and I suspect since everybody's being polite, given the Washington political dynamic, my guess is that sometime in this calendar year, there will come a moment where the imperative to be seen as doing something and something real will be overwhelming, And one of our purposes in this report is to start doing the thinking, so that there is not a panic without the raw material to craft a plan.
I think that pretty much puts an exclamation point on our discussion. We're going to continue for about a half hour to hearing from people in the audience if they have questions. And I'd like to do that. But Geisha, how do we handle these questions? If somebody has a microphone? So who would like to ask the first one? And, right over here, because I saw your hand go up first. Why don't you go ahead and identify yourself if you can.
Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. Earlier this week, the New York Times reported that the State Department's Global Engagement Center, out of an authorization of about $120 million, as of a few weeks ago, had spent $0 on combating Russian misinformation, had hired no Russian speakers as part of that effort. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are putting the final touches on the fiscal 2018 foreign aid spending bill. I think they thought that they had done a good job in the previous 2 years' measures of giving direction to the State Department's GEC to reorient itself away from a focus on countering jihadist ideology to focusing on Russia. If you had a chance to talk to any people putting in the final language, what would you tell them to do, since it does appear Secretary Tillerson isn't viewing this issue as a priority? Thank you.
Okay, I think I did address this kind of early on, but first of all, the New York Times article got a couple things wrong. One, there was no money appropriated, so there's no $120 million sitting on a shelf anywhere. There was an authorization which allowed us to go to the Department of Defense and ask for up to $60 million in each of the last 2 fiscal years. Secretary Tillerson and the team at the State Department has been seized with this issue, really looking at it very closely. Part of that process that you're talking about shifting from countering jihadist ideology to countering state ideology, has entailed, really looking at how we're doing these things, which of these skill sets transfer over, how are we going to restructure our work. That process has taken a little bit of time. We have gone to the Department of Defense and asked for $40 million. That money will likely hit our accounts very shortly. You mentioned that there's Congress is in the final stages of appropriating a budget, after which, according to legislation, there's a 2-week, 15-day notification period before the Department of Defense can transfer these funds over to the GEC. That said, other things that were wrong, the idea that there are no Russian speakers, I can tell you absolutely is wrong. I am fluent in Russian, as are several of my other colleagues at the GEC. I think the journalist was looking at a particular subunit of the GEC that was focused on countering jihadist ideology, and there were no Russian speakers in that particular unit, but he may have misunderstood that to mean, be indicative of the whole organization. And then finally, just really to re-emphasize again that the GEC has been working, under the direction of Secretary Tillerson over the last year to, continue to enhance our abilities to monitor and analyze this particular issue as this evolving threat, to be able to better coordinate across the interagency, to be able to, focus our efforts and address gaps. The only piece of this that we haven't sort of been able to do because of the appropriation issue has been to be able to set up a fund, to be able to push money out to, as Ambassador Fried indicated, to support civil society organizations, media organizations, others who are developing technologies, monitoring bots, who are, monitoring, the disinformation threat. And obviously those resources, as soon as we get them, we'll be looking to spend them as expeditiously as possible.
Okay, who else do we have here? Gentleman here, and Geisha.
Hi, so my name's Joshua. I'm a student in William & Mary, so this might just be my naivety as like a young person speaking, but I'm not really sure that the West and the democracies really have a monopoly on the correct information. And I was just wondering if you all seem to believe that we do have some sort of monopoly on information, because you can just look at the coverage of Fox News or even CNN on things like climate change, putting like climate skeptics and people who are actually climate scientists on equal footing. coverage of Black Lives Matter or something like that, painting people who are out in Ferguson protesting police brutality as thugs and criminals, whereas groups like Sputnik and RT were actually just portraying them as protesters. Or like the article that people have been mentioning in the New York Times, how that's not really been accurate that much either, and how there was recently one that came out covering the Saudi prince, sort of like showing him as some sort of moderate reformer, even though he's still the dictator of a reactionary theocracy. So do you all think that we actually have a monopoly on information?
Let me start this, but I'd like to pass it along. First of all, because I'm a journalist, absolutely no one journalist or a journalism outlet, no one government has a monopoly on information. That's why I go to work every day to ferret through the information. We do fact checks essentially on disinformation, and there is an enormous amount of disinformation, I can tell you as a journalist that covers this, that is being aimed at various parts of the world, that is coming out of Russia and some of Russia's associates. That doesn't mean that the media and even the government here in the United States and in Europe are blameless in terms of telling the truth all the time. I mean, if you look at the American media landscape right now, you have, when I started in my career, you had a mainstream media that was pretty much covering news, we thought pretty straight at the time, but now you have a whole panoply of news organizations from Fox to MSNBC and that sort of thing. So I think what's important is that as a consumer, you're looking at all of that and you're analyzing that. But I do think there is a problem that we're watching, and we've decided we're covering that problem. In some of our fact checks, we will also go into the fact that what the US government may or may not be saying is completely accurate or something that you would consider right. So for example, one particular Russian actor was saying that the bombing of Raqqa was the same as Dresden. And that's kind of gotten out there. And you can see that Raqqa has been pretty much demolished, but it was not the bombing of Dresden, which was a night or two, as I recall, tens of thousands of people firebombing. So we got into that, but we also pointed out that in the last year, there have been an increased number of civilian deaths. And some of that had to do with changing policies on how the US and the coalition in Syria was dealing with it. Some of it had to do with Islamic State purposely bringing in enemy fire into residential areas and where people were staying. So no, there is no monopoly. But I'd like to also pass this along.
I think you're pointing to a much bigger issue, right? Clearly, it is the role of civil society and independent media to hold governments accountable, right, for the information they put out. This is why investigative journalism, kind of that Jim does and his colleagues do, is so critical. And that capability, that capacity has been hollowed out in the independent media space. I think that is shifting now as we see major publications reinvesting into investigative journalism work again. I think that's a good thing, because that is the function of independent civil society media in a democracy. But I think you're pointing to two other issues I think are really critical in the transformation of the information space more broadly. I think on the one hand, there is becoming more and more difficult, almost impossible to distinguish between opinion making and news, right? And what you see on many of these television broadcast channels is the merger of the two. And then information is being presented as if it's news, but it's actually opinions, right? And this is, I think, a broader problem that we don't delve into, but it's something to be aware of as a consumer. The other piece you point to is this balance objective that journalists and editors often like to stick to. But our adversaries have exploited this. So, for example, why would you give a platform to a propagandist from RT at the same level as a reporter from on the ground in Syria, for example, right? Like, this balance imperative has gotten, I think, morphed and corrupted in a way. And I think there is a role for, we don't get into this, for editorial boards in news agencies to play, to be much more aware of how they're framing debates on their platforms, who they're inviting on their television shows, and they're not giving a platform to individuals or organizations that are just going to spew out lies, right?
Can I just add
Go ahead.
something real quick? So two things. One, your question shows me that it's still important to go back to definitions, right? Disinformation, misinformation, they're not fake news, they're not propaganda. We were having a conversation earlier this morning. They're not the same thing. And I think this is something for people to understand where there's intent behind it and maybe even a political objective behind it. It's completely different from a mistake a journalist makes in an article and then there can be a retraction or a correction, which is legitimate. What legitimate journalism does. And then the second thing, the Kremlin has gotten really, really good at spreading this doubt that journalistic truth actually exists, and instilling the idea that they're just opinions. There's no one fact or truth. Everybody has an opinion about it. So there's this ambiguity that I think we need to get out of, which is why I don't like the post-truth syntagm, right? That was the term of the year last year. There is still truth, there are still facts, it's just how the way you report it. I think that's the crucial difference.
Geisha?
Geisha Gonzalez, Atlantic Council. Ambassador O'Sullivan, this question is specifically for you. The report talks about the East Stratcom team as being one of the examples that need to be provided more resources and needs to really be empowered to conduct its mission because we find it so key. So one of the key recommendations is having every member state provide a seconded national expert to actually add resources to the team. The Dutch Parliament voted to disband the East Stratcom team in the last day because it said that it infringed on freedom of speech. What do you make of this claim, and what are your views on the East Stratcom team?
Well, I'm always grateful when any report suggests giving more resources to the European institutions, so thank you for that. I think just for the audience who are maybe not familiar, the East Stratcom is a very small team of people that were set up within the External Action Service, the European Diplomatic Service, to address this issue of disinformation, and they have done I think a remarkable job. It's a very small team of people, and the main tool has been transparency. I mean, they have a website which is where you can see examples of misinformation and conscious targeting by particularly Russia or others of messages which are false and which are designed to deceive. So I think it has worked very well. There is, going back to the earlier discussion about freedom of speech and so forth, they are not interfering in any way with the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression. They're just putting out they're explaining examples of disinformation and making it public. And to your point, you're absolutely right. There is no monopoly of truth. And the whole point is we need a multiplicity of media sources, and some of that will be deliberately biased. I mean, some of it will be explicitly right-wing or explicitly liberal, and you know that when you go on it. That's what you're expected to get. What is worrying at the present time is this complete blurring of any understanding of where the information is coming from. It goes viral. It goes on social media. People get all upset. Have you seen that this person? There was this terrible thing done. They discovered it never even happened. So I think this is what we've been trying to do through the Stratcom. I think it would be great if we could slightly reinforce it. But I mean, it's part of the toolbox which is identified. But it is a toolbox which contains many different tools, and absolutely no silver bullet. It's not the ultimate answer. Maybe there are some lessons. They have been here several times. We've had discussions with the Department of State. We've been to Silicon Valley. So we're, and I agree entirely with Dan that we're in this together, and we need to share our experience and best practice.
We have a question all the way in the back, the woman in the back. Yes, you.
Thank you for this panel. I'm Dr. Sereo. I'm the Associate Rector of UACU, WIUU in Kiev, Ukraine. And I'm here today because of this panel. Speaking specifically to the points that were made about transparency and labeling, helping to label for the lack of transparency that we have, and also organizations that are already set up maybe for being able to respond to the issues, such as Homeland Security, maybe in partnership with the State Department, which can't deal with the domestic issues but could deal with the foreign issues. In other words, partnering for, you get a double bang. What would you see as 3 very specific actions that can be taken now? I mean, like within a month, versus more discussions around things that we need to do versus taking some actions based on what we already have at hand so we can do it. Thank you.
Well, all right, so if I had a magic wand loaded with one wish for this area, I guess it would be that the U.S. and Europe, or the U.S. and key European governments, identify democratic defense against disinformation as a strategic priority, and outline actions and process designed to combat it. And if that's done, I believe the governments can plant the flag and thereby give backing to the elements, the East Stratcom or, the State Department's team, the Global Engagement Center. That requires leadership from the top. That empowers the people in governments that are trying to do the right thing. But it can't be just governments. They need to reach out to the social media companies who have been engaging in Washington in a somewhat charged atmosphere of congressional hearings, which are not the right vehicle to produce good policy. And the European and American governments need to reach out on even a higher level to the civil society groups trying to do something about it. So my one wish, you said the next month or 2, plant the flag. That in government, that's how you use that. To do that, you use speeches by senior officials who set out an agenda. It has to be a substance speech. That's what I would do. And use the ideas here, talk to the Europeans, get an independent perspective, pull that together. And the ideas in this paper were intended to help. All right, so that's what I would do.
The gentleman back here about the 4th row.
Good morning. My name is Bob Homans with Aperio Associates. I wanted to ask you if you see yourselves in the near future sitting where you're sitting now with experts from countries like the Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, talking about Chinese disinformation. And if the answer is yes, what is your feeling about the increasing cooperation between big U.S. tech companies and the Chinese government?
Well, without naming specific countries, because that would be fairly undiplomatic, I will say that our mandate in the Global Engagement Center is to lead, synchronize, and coordinate all U.S. government activities to counter both state and non-state actors. And so the mandate is broad. It's not limited to one particular country. In response to the previous question, I will say that we're already doing this. We're not sitting idle. There are multiple campaigns that are being developed and executed against state what we view as disinformation efforts by state adversaries. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to go into details about exactly what we're doing, but rest assured that we are working actively on that. As far as another thing that I think you can expect to see in the next month, that would be this Information Access Fund, which we've already announced and put out a notice, so that organizations can apply for funding directly from the Global Engagement Center, specifically to engage in these types of activities. And so, for those who represent organizations that might be interested in that, please go to grants.gov and find that notice and take a look at the application requirements. But I will finish by, I think, saying that, and I think Alina said earlier, we would be foolish if we were focused on a single adversary here. And even, it's important to note that our adversaries will not always be state actors. These are technologies that, have already been let out of the genie's bottle. They're not going to be going back in. And I think, we need to be mindful of the fact that, lots of different actors out there are going to be taking advantage of these. And as we develop the tools and the mechanisms and processes to be able to, and the partnerships to be able to respond to this effectively, we need to make sure that we're not, that we're keeping that broad focus.
Alina, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, the whole purpose of this report was to say we should learn from what the Kremlin has done, but we should not limit ourselves to responding in kind directly to their campaigns, right? Because this is a problem that will continue to haunt us. It will continue to be an issue, and these tools are going to be used by any malicious actor, and they're very cheap. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me, right? That if you have China or other resource-rich actors, Russia is not as resource-rich as China, obviously, deciding that they're going to use these tools to undermine, or influence narratives in Africa, in its own neighborhood, in Latin America, wherever. These are things already happening, right? And in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe in the next 5 years, this is all going to shift quite dramatically. And I think for us to get ahead of it, not to just say, let's respond, let's counter, right? Let's be on the defensive. We need to be on the offensive. And we need to be thinking about how do we get ahead in the emerging technologies world, right? We've been relying on Silicon Valley to give us answers, but sometimes Silicon Valley gives us problems too, right? And the Chinese have a plan to be the leader on these technologies. The Russians don't have a plan, but they say they're going to be the leader on these technologies. So we need leadership from the top, as Dan was saying, not just to make this a strategic priority, but to also make it a long-term priority that the United States will lead on these issues together with our allies.
I just wanted to take a point of personal privilege and ask, if you're talking about getting ahead of these issues, and we go back to the issue of who's right and who isn't, the divisions in democratic societies in Europe and America are deep. And are those divisions a weakness or a strength?
Well, what can I possibly say? I'm suspicious of calls for national unity if that means that partisan differences are regarded as illegitimate. The way I would like to put it is we need to, in the United States, it would be nice to remember who we are as a nation, what we've stood for, and how much success we have had when we've remembered who we are. But there are, in Europe, there is a part of the right, the hard right, which sort of likes Putin. It's not a secret. But no one is going to defend, or I'm not interested in the defense of Russian disinformation and cyber hacking. So we have to separate the politics from this. Right. And in the United States, since I'm no longer in government, I can say that the issue of combating Russian disinformation has to be separated from the political impact in the 2016 election. The argument has to be separated so that because we want the administration at the top at the political level to champion this issue without a partisan agenda. So that's the limited area in which I would agree with you. And I think it's possible to do it, and I don't want to put our administration representative in a tough spot here.
I'll just add one thing. I think in the long run, the freewheeling, freedom of expression, differences that are apparent in the United States are a strength. And I'll give you some examples from my, career that I've seen. Some of the tools in this toolbox include, well used, tried and true public diplomacy tools, including, for example, exchanges. And one of the most powerful things I've ever seen in terms of building resilience and, in terms of, making people understand the United States, is simply bringing people to the United States. And what they see when they come here, and they always tell me when they come back to whatever country they came from, is that made the most impression on them, like for example during the Iraq War, was coming to the United States and seeing that there are a lot of Americans that disagreed with the administration's position on that. And they were flabbergasted to think that people were perfectly comfortable talking about those differences of opinions with foreigners. Or bringing, the fact that the US embassies around the world will bring out expert US speakers to talk on specific subjects, including our elections, including, some of the most sensitive political issues in the United States. And often those speakers will disagree with the very administration that's paying to bring them out to talk about these issues. Those things, that powerful example of a society which is comfortable with this type of differences of opinion, comfortable with the democratic process, which can ultimately resolve those things, I think is too valuable for us to compromise on, and in the long run will be one of the most powerful assets I think we have in this particular battle.
I think we have.
Just very briefly, we should not have a historical view of what's happening today, right? The tools may be new, the digital tools, the cyber tools, but this desire by malicious actors to try to divide our societies has been around forever, basically. I mean, certainly the Soviet Union invested many more resources than Russia currently does into trying to drive wedges and undermine, or amplify divisions in the United States and elsewhere. And they were actually quite effective. I would highly recommend that everybody read The Sword and the Shield, which is a tome of KGB operations in the United States. You'll be surprised at some of these theories that you thought were perhaps based in fact were actually plans by the KGB. So these are things that have been around. I think the difference now is that we kind of went to sleep for a while and stopped investing in the tools of resistance and resilience, and that's what we need to ramp up again as quickly as possible.
Those were such good sum-up comments, but I think we have time for one or two more questions, depending on how deep they are. The young woman in the third row.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I'm Jenny Holm from Internews. My question is for the authors of the report. I'm curious about the comments that you received from the platforms when you sent them the draft in two particular areas. One, what they said about the difficulty of identifying bot accounts in the first place in order to be able to mute them. And second, whether there was any discussion of the fact that their business models rely so inherently on monetizing attention and therefore incentivize the production and distribution of sensationalist content that evokes emotional reactions, divisive content, whether it's produced by bots or actual humans.
Sure. Well, so you'll notice that in the forward we actually thank the policy teams of Facebook and Twitter for providing their comments on earlier drafts. I do think they were useful in terms of their ability to identify bot accounts or troll accounts. Frankly, my impression from those conversations is that to some extent they're limited in their ability to identify these kinds of accounts, and they're trying. I think Twitter has been a little bit further behind than Facebook, for example. I think Facebook has taken some steps and they are experimenting with different policies. There's been a lot of announcements about this, obviously, from Zuckerberg and others. But I think what they're also realizing is that as automated accounts become more sophisticated through the same AI tools that they now use to identify those accounts, it is becoming more and more difficult, right? And yes, on the bottom line question, clearly these firms profit from having more and more users, right? So of course, if it turned out that hypothetically 30% of Twitter's users are automated accounts or trolls, this would literally hit their stock prices. So there's a disincentive in some ways for them to actually look into this deeply, right? That being said, I do think the pressure is working, and Facebook, for example, has taken a profitability hit from some of the changes they've implemented recently. I hope that they will realize that Facebook has a lot of money to fund research, to share data with researchers. Right now it's very difficult to do any sort of research externally on tracking what's actually happening on Facebook specifically, because they're not very good about sharing data with researchers. I think they are changing these policies, so I think there's good little breadcrumbs there, but it's going to take, I think, a lot more pressure. But I will say that they were really helpful and open to the conversation when we had it multiple times in different parts of those organizations.
Dr. Freed, did you have anything, Ambassador Freed, did you have anything else to add to this?
No, that pretty much covers it. The social media companies have an incentive structure. Governments and society have an ability to change that incentive structure. A diplomatic tactic is, though we didn't say it explicitly, is how much pain do you want to put yourselves through before you decide to do the right thing? I mean, that's sometimes, it's not just, let's say, steel and aluminum tariffs where that message can be useful. It can be useful in all kinds of ways.
I did promise the ambassador we wouldn't get into steel and aluminum tariffs in this discussion.
It was the end. I saved it for the end. He did a great job on NPR this morning.
Yes, he did. I've seen a lot of other hands up, and unfortunately, I think we've run out of time. Is that right? So it has been a great discussion. I wanted to thank the authors of the report, and I also wanted to thank a very large audience that came out and listened the whole time. Thank you very much.